Thank you very much. I want to, I've got a title which is very grand, and it's about something really quite straightforward, people-powered healthcare, which is very grand. And the reason it's quite straightforward is that it's about the vast majority of patients that are confronting healthcare systems across the world now are those with long-term conditions. And the secret is in the sort of title. If you have a long-term condition, by definition you have it for a long time. And if you have it for a long time, you get to know about it. And if you get to know about it, you have a stock of knowledge about what this thing is doing to you. And the purpose of people-powered healthcare is how do we use and relate our stock of knowledge, called medicine, to that stock of knowledge called knowledge about my healthcare, and how do we actually engage that in a dialogue that we really haven't done up till now. And given the number of people that are coming forward with long-term conditions, and given the demand on the health service, I think the point I'd like to make is that that demand for that new form of care means we cannot go on meeting it in the way in which we met the old form of care. So there needs to be, the point of the dialogue I'm talking about, we need to develop a new form of care for what is going to be a new form of business for healthcare services. And that involves much, much more interaction with patients. Some points about the NHS, about organisationally. I was involved with three New Labour politicians as reforming the National Health Service between 2001 and 2007. And one of the things you realise when you're doing this is you're actually reforming something that people really love. They don't really like, but they love. And that's quite an important distinction, because if you mess with the NHS, there are real problems. And actually what we're talking about in this particular form of change I'm talking about is changing the National Health Service. And so this is something where we have in British society, the NHS represents the way in which the British would really like to see themselves if they weren't the way in which they are. And what I mean by that, this is something where they give to each other, they receive from each other, and it's a very collective organisation. We don't do it with anything else apart from healthcare. We only do it with healthcare. And that's because this was constructed in the immediate post-war period, and the point I'm making about that in this session is that actually it was constructed in the post-war period as a nationalised industry. We nationalised lots of things after the Second World War, rail, steel, coal mines, and health. And in nationalising the health service, we created a very large national institution. And the reason people love the National Health Service is because it's national and it's organised by the nation for everybody. They don't love other nationalised industries, but they do love the National Health Service. And that means because it's a nationalised industry, it's organised in a particular way, like all of our nationalised industries are organised, which is very top-down. People like to describe the National Health Service as a command and control institution. For those of you that work with it, no, it's not a command institution. It's not a command and control institution. It's a command institution with no control whatsoever. There's a great deal of shouting, but actually very little control. But the issue about it being run nationally, top-down, means it is not set up to have consumers as a major part of the institution, because the institution's run from a very, very long way away. So we have an organisational structure which mitigates against what I'm referring to as people-powered health. Secondly, because it's medicine we're talking about, we have a form of knowledge which mitigates against customers being involved. Medicine, as a practice and a branch of knowledge, has been immensely successful and continues to be immensely successful in moving forward knowledge at the service of humanity. However, it does that in a particular way. It moves forward that knowledge by talking to itself and moving forward that knowledge in a very rarefied atmosphere of research and medicine. People do not understand, the public do not understand almost anything at all about the knowledge of medicine. And medicine doesn't spend any time trying to translate that to the public. It has moved forward very successfully and helped humanity by talking to itself. And therefore, in something which, as far as health service is concerned, which is essentially applied 1 million consultations every 36 hours in the National Health Service. So this knowledge is being applied 1 million times every 36 hours. It's being applied to people that don't know anything about it in terms of the nature of knowledge. So if you want to share, we've got an organisation which is very top-down, and we have a branch of knowledge where the people that have that knowledge aren't really taught or have much incentive to share that knowledge. And so if you ever go in and say to a doctor, what does that mean? Getting something out which is a genuine amalgamation of medical knowledge and your life is quite difficult. You sometimes get a string of medical knowledge, and you'll sometimes be told to do more exercise. But the relationship between these two things isn't very clear. So if the problem I'm posing is how do we get much more empowered consumers of healthcare, we're doing it in an organisation. We're doing it in an organisation of the National Health Service which hasn't empowered consumers, and we're doing it with a branch of knowledge which actually doesn't empower consumers either. And that means this is probably why patients are less empowered than almost any other consumers of other sets of industries. And so there are reasons this is going to be very hard to do, rather than the fact that people who run the systems are in some way arrogant or bad as people. There's something intrinsically problematic about involving consumers in of healthcare, and there's something that is incredibly important about it. And the reason it's incredibly important is that we are changing the business we're involved in. The nature of long-term conditions has meant that every healthcare system across the world is changing and will continue to change dramatically what it's dealing with as healthcare needs. The nature of disease has changed, but the organisations through which we meet that disease has not changed. And that is the epochal change that's going on in healthcare systems across the world. In the UK, at the moment, if you're over the age of 75, you're more than likely to have 2 long-term conditions. If you're over the age of 85, you're more than likely to have 3 long-term conditions. And there's a report out today that says just in the next 10 years, that's going to get a lot worse. So the majority of people that come to see us, the vast majority of people that come to see us, actually have something which they won't recover from, in a simple sense of recovering from, and they also probably have more than one thing. And this is increasing because of the successes of acute care. When I grew up in the 1950s, my uncle had a heart attack, he died. People who had heart attacks in the 1950s died. Now they don't. They have heart disease for 20 years longer. In 2006 in England, the majority of people started to survive cancer. It became 50%, now it's about 60%. So we are creating long-term conditions all the time, and that's a really good thing. But actually it means there are more long-term conditions, and therefore this problem we're talking about is growing all the time. This is not just, I think I'd suggest, the fact that there's extra demand, it is the fact the demand that's coming through. If you're dealing with an 85-year-old with 3 long-term conditions, it's a different sort of healthcare demand from when you were dealing with a 75-year-old that needed a hip replacement. So we need a different model of care to deal with this different sort of demand. And so what's different about the nature of long-term conditions? The list is the same across the world. And again, the point I'm making, this isn't just an English and Irish and a European problem. In the Indian subcontinent, there'll be 300 million people with diabetes by the year 2020. Why are they there? Because they died before. They're only now getting old enough to get diabetes. So actually, the change of longevity is what's bringing about these diseases. Unless something catastrophic happens, then actually that longevity will continue. The essence of a long-term disease is that whilst it may well be a medical condition, dealing with it has psychological medical, and social aspects. So everybody virtually that has a long-term condition will do better if they do some exercise. Exercise is a social intervention. If you're being dealt with purely by medics, then you'll go to the medics for a medical intervention, but actually you'll need a social and a psychological intervention. Not only is exercise important, but empowerment on being on top of that disease is totally different in how you deal with it than if you're underneath it. If in fact you've got diabetes and you've got arthritis, it's quite likely you'll be a bit depressed because actually you're in a lot of pain and you have to organise your life differently. And if you're depressed, it's quite difficult to get on top of those conditions and manage them. So the psychological element of being in charge of the condition rather than condition being in charge of you is a crucial part of better management. If that's not a part of what the interventions are, if it's just a medical intervention, then we've got a real problem. Equally, if we're not recognising the social nature of those interventions, we will not improve management of long-term conditions. The crucial thing is, we all talk about self-management of long-term conditions as if we introduce self-management to the patient. A patient self-manages. That's what they do. If they have a long-term condition, they have it. This may seem an odd statistic, but they have it for about 5,800 waking hours a year. That's what they do. They wake up in the morning with aches and pains. They wake up in the morning a bit pissed off. They wake up in the morning worried about something. And that means they need to manage it. Unless they're very ill, they will see the health service for no more than about 10 hours a year. 5,800 hours, 10 hours, which is the most important number. If we can increase the productivity of those 5,800 hours by 3 or 4%, we have transformed the health service. If we increase the productivity of the 10 hours, double it, it's quite helpful, but it doesn't matter. If the 10 hours can be invested in the 5,800 hours, so in fact we're not just leaving most self-management goes on because it's based upon what your family experience, what your friends have experienced. Oh, I always do this, I always do that. Quite useful, but it's not empowered by medical knowledge generally. If the people with the medical knowledge invested that medical knowledge into the people that have the 5,800 hours to spend with the long-term conditions, then you start to get a different equation about productivity of those 5,800 hours. So people do self-manage. They do it all the time. That's what they've got. That's all they've got. That and their friends and family. Now, what do you do in the morning if you're, oh, right, you do that, do you? I get arthritis, so I swim every morning. Oh, well, that's interesting. I do. That's what I do. I've not been to the health service with it, because I know they'll have a completely different view of my arthritis than I've got. And I don't trust the fact that they will negotiate with me about my view and their view. They'll say, have these pills, and I'll say no, and there's no point in going for that conversation. So I will be self-managing, but without the assistance of a health service. So improving the productivity, not just in human terms, but in terms of sustainability of health services, improving the productivity of those 5,800 hours in better self-managing is actually probably, for me, the greatest question that health services have to deal with. What do we mean by it? In England, there's 16 million people with long-term conditions. That's a lot of people. There's a lot of people that are experiencing this, and by and large, they're experiencing on their own. They do, obviously, because there's 16 million of them, bump into each other. And they talk about it, right? And so we have got, thank goodness, we do have some social interaction about it. But is it organised by the health service? Oh, no. That's organised by them. The health service sees them as 16 million individuals. Very odd. Do you know people keep coming through with the same thing? Isn't that strange, right? And so grouping these things that are seen individual is an asset that we are not engaged, we as a health service are not as engaged with as we should be. We are individualising something which has got a whole series of groups in it. So we need to recognise as a health service that power exists in that self-management. And what we need to do is spend the time we've got better investing in that. And to do that, we need to uncover some elements of motivation. And when I do go and see the doctor and they say, you need to do more exercise, and I come back and I haven't done it, they say, why haven't you done more exercise? And I think, well, why should I in the first place? The nature of the motivation is actually the crucial element of the interaction between a health service. How do we find what that motivation is? One of the great phrases that Don Berwick uses in the Institute of Health Improvement is the shift from what is the matter with you to what matters to you. If my motivation is I really want to see my grandchildren, but I'm so crippled or anxious or depressed that I don't get to see my grandchildren, utilizing that motivation is one way of constructing a relationship with with my better self-management. Everybody has got elements of that motivation. Finding what it is an absolutely crucial part of starting the better self-management intervention. And different parts of the health NHS is different needs of people-powered health. I went to an optician, but this happened to me about 4 or 5 years ago, and they said, don't worry, you might have diabetes. It's a great phrase, don't worry if you might have diabetes. Go and see the GP. Went to see the GP, had some blood tests. They were sent, because the blood tests couldn't be dealt with by the GP, they were sent to Guy's and Tommy's. They lost them, went back, had them again. And when I went in to see the GP, I wanted the GP at that moment to be completely definitive. You either have or you have not got diabetes. And the moment after they were completely definitive, I wanted them to be completely democratic and talk to me about what we could do about this together. That's quite a hard ask. But and then I hadn't got diabetes and I never thought about it again. Because the moment after you get a disease is a totally different motivational issue from the moment you've got it. And we generally don't use those moments as an attempt to change the capacity to self-management. So we talk a lot about primary prevention, very difficult primary prevention. Secondary prevention, now you're ill, let's manage it better, is a different set of interventions. So searching for motivation is a lot easier at the moment when I know I'm ill. The problem is the doctor's got 7 minutes to search for that motivation. They're not going to find it unless they are really, really geniuses at it. And so there needs to be an immediate referral to someone that's got more time to do that. And this is a list of very different forms of the way in which, in a sense, the voluntary sector and patients are coming to the aid of the doctor to give more time. Fred had diabetes 6 months ago. He's prepared to talk to you about it. Go and have an hour with Fred. And Fred will then talk to you about what you do, and you'll be able to have a conversation with him for an hour. Expert patient groups, we have taught a group of people who have diabetes how to talk to you about having diabetes. And that investment actually means you can have a couple of hours with people on a regular basis about the nature of your diabetes. Group consultation, there's a series of places where now people with pain are meeting as a group rather than a series of individual relationships with consultants. And that group relationship means there is a discussion between them. How do you find this? How do you find that? So actually the utilization of fellow patients is a major way in which you change the nature of the amount of time you can have. An hour with a patient costs a lot less than 2 minutes with a doctor, but it is 30 times longer. Social prescribing is happening in a number of parts of the country. In Newcastle, where I'm involved in it, doctors don't say just have some drugs. They say you need to go and talk to a health trainer for a while to work out how you're going to do the exercise with both. So actually, this is all an attempt to find an increase in the capacity that the patient has got to better self-manage their care. Now, the problems of this are, given what I said in the first 2 slides, is enormous. We have very successfully, and the increased specialization in medicine has been a really good thing in that it has saved hundreds of thousands of lives. increased specialisation is a good thing. However, if you have 3 long-term conditions, you will have 3 specialists looking after your long-term conditions, each of which is pretty sure they own you. You're my patient, you're my patient, you're my patient. You have 3 people thinking they own you without ever probably talking to each other about the person they own. In England, if you have diabetes, only 20% of people who have diabetes only have diabetes. So if I'm a diabetologist and I treat you as if you've only got diabetes, I am wrong 80% of the time. That's a pretty big number. And if I'm not thinking, so I might have diabetes, and probably a person who's talking to a person with diabetes, a doctor might well say, you've got to remember that. A good phrase, but another 20% of the people with diabetes have dementia. So the phrase you've got to remember that is a bit problematic. But you don't think that, because I'm only dealing with you as a person with diabetes. So the very successful, and I'm not playing this, it is very, when I'm ill, I like to be seen by a specialist, because it's a very successful thing. How you tie that together is something that health services have failed to do. In my country, we have enormous problems about people with mental illness getting virtually no treatment whatsoever for their physical illnesses, and vice versa. We have enormous problems. People with severe and enduring mental illness die 20 years younger, and that's primarily because of an acute illness, a physical illness rather than a mental illness, because we just are not treating. So the lack of integration is enormous. Each specialist who's talking to you rarely looks at the person that walks in as a patient as someone who might have some assets. They are seen as a deficit. You've got something wrong with you. And actually the assets that people have are rarely utilised as a way of building up their own capacity to self-manage. It does take more time, and I'm suggesting that the way in which we need to deal with that time is not have the most senior, expensive professionals pretending they've got the time to deal with this. But that we do need a whole range of other people coming into the consulting room and discussing as patients and as others about how we're going to spend more time doing that. And they need to seek out the assets that exist in people's lives. And some of the mechanics of this, we can ask everybody, every patient, about a patient activation measurement. One particular year, you may be X. If at the end of the year your patient activation has gone down, then actually the National Health Service has failed to invest in your capacity to better self-manage. You are a less active patient. If we've made you a less active patient, whatever else we've done to you, we've failed to increase your capacity to better self-manage. So everybody can actually take that patient activation. How have we increased your activation? How we constructed shared decision-making. Work in England on shared decision-making has shown that if you do a shared decision-making process about hip and knee replacements, there are less operations, because people think, oh, I'm not quite sure I want and need that. Social prescribing, I've suggested, is doctors actually prescribing a relationship with a voluntary organisation. Peer supports. So all of these are different aspects of self-management. And we have got some of this happening. I would think at the moment probably across about 5 to 6% of England there are elements of this happening, and looking at the nature of asset-based approaches. Technology, a lot of what I see downstairs, a lot of the next 2 days is about technology. In my experience, most of the public and most of the people that work in the health service live more technologically enabled lives than in their workplace. Again, I live quite close to Guy's and Tommy's, and it's quite interesting, at a shift change, you'll see people coming out and organising the rest of their lives on their iPhones and iPads in a way in which they don't when they're inside the room. We have much more. When I was involved in government, we were trying to develop an IT program, and the idea was you had to buy all the IT that was necessary. Actually, the public invest much more in IT every day than NHS does in a year. It's out there. We have to use their IT rather than actually think we're supplying it. And so people have all sorts of motivations about using the better end of IT. And the way in which software is developed by proper software manufacturers is to make sure it fits in with people's lives. The gamification of the things we're talking about, how do we turn these into proper games that people can play and learn as they're playing, is something that happens in almost every other walk of life, but very rarely in health. So the knowledge turned into a game is something that will drag many, many more people involved in it. And I don't go, as an old person, with the idea that older people are not technologically enabled. There's many of people that are generations above me that are much more technologically enabled because they've got the motivation to do so. Modern software, and I've known this for more than a decade, modern software learns about consumers. Amazon bookstore tells me the books I want to read in July before I go on holiday, and it knows more about them than I do, because it's been looking at all the books I buy every July, and it thinks he likes thrillers to go on holiday. And honestly, it tells me more than I know about myself, because it's bothered to think about what I've been talking about to it, rather than actually throwing that away. The amount of knowledge we throw away in healthcare systems that is given to us by consumers is shocking. So capturing that knowledge and then using it and playing it back to people. And there are thousands and thousands of apps that are really linked to health services. Loads of people, 3 million people in England now have Fitbits or are counting the number of steps they do. Of those 3 million, I would think barely 100,000 relate to the NHS at all. They are separate, so we have massive amounts of knowledge which we don't allow into our system because we haven't bothered to use that knowledge. So technology is constructing vast amounts of data which needs to be allowed into the system. And my final point is that there has been, over the years, a sort of moral argument that we should be involving patients much more in their healthcare, and it is a moral argument. Of course we should. It's a sort of should sort of argument. But actually, the point I'm making isn't a moral one, it is not just a moral one, it's a material one. If we don't involve consumers much more in the better management of their long-term conditions, no health system will survive in 15 years' time, given the amount of demand coming down the road. Across the world, will not be enough doctors and nurses to deal with all of the long-term conditions coming down the road. And under those circumstances, no good saying we need more. There won't be more. We need different. And most other industries, in taking that different, in retail banking, in supermarkets, in most retail now, the consumer does much more work than they were doing 15 years ago, and we need to ensure that health services do that. And so it is actually, for me, a material issue about how we work this into a much bigger part of the system than we have at the moment, in order to make sure that there is any sustainability in our health systems at all. Thanks a lot.